Hello and welcome to session 255 in the AISafety.com reading group. Tonight we'll be discussing the Less Wrong post Where I Agree and Disagree with Eliezer by Paul Cristiano. Let me just get the video done. Paul Cristiano is one of the perhaps one of the two most famous alignment researchers and the head of the Alignment Research Center. This is a 2 months old post, and on Less Wrong it has the most upvotes of any post ever, so that's quite an achievement. And we'll be going through the first half today, which means we'll cover all the points of agreements and the first 10 points of disagreements. Paul Cristiano describes this work as somewhat of a response to Eliezer's post AGI Ruin, a list of lethalities, and it's also rambling in the same way and not exhaustive. I think in general making a presentation and analysis of rambling style post is kind of hard. I didn't do it for Eliezer's posts, and also like Eliezer is way more rambling than Paul Cristiano is in this post. We'll start by going through the agreements. And one thing I should say up front is Eliezer Yudkowsky in the comments said this is a solid contribution and thank you, not just for the agreements but for like the total post. Now splitting up into agreements and disagreements is not obvious how you do that, because if one person says there's 30% probability of a fast takeoff and the other person says there's like 50%, then is that an agreement or a disagreement? The way I think about it is like Paul Cristiano imagines a median less wrong poster reader, and if that person has probabilities in between Eliezer and Paul Cristiano, then it's a disagreement, and if they are on the same side, different from what the median reader will expect, then it's an agreement. I will also note some references if Paul is referencing something from Eliezer's post, then I'll note what the point, like it's point B38 or something like that, so we can later go back, because Paul Cristiano said that he is not making an exhaustive reply, and I want to see what parts it doesn't cover. So for the first agreement, which is that there is a good chance that we will see AI disempowering humanity, and disempowering is used instead of killing, as Eliezer would do, because he expects this is easier. I think you can call it an agreement with the definition that it's both are more pessimistic than the median less wrong reader, but there is quite a difference between the statements made by Eliezer Yudkowsky and the ones made by Paul Cristiano. Eliezer is much more pessimistic and doesn't really talk about disempowering as much as just outright killing. Paul Cristiano gives his probability of doom 20% rather than 99.99, and his timelines are probably longer than Eliezer's, 15% in 2030, 40% in 2040, and around 30% probability of a fast takeoff. You may say something like, how can you have a higher probability of a fast takeoff than doom? That seems very unlikely that there is a 50% probability that a fast takeoff will go well. I don't think this is something we should put a lot of weight on. In general, when people make these kind of statements, they use some numbers that change very much, and they try hard not to like anchor too much on their own previous estimates. So we should take this with a very, very large grain of salt. On the timelines, at least something like soon is something that both Paul Cristiano and Eliezer Yudkowsky agrees on. And they also agree that we won't get a fire alarm or any kind of thing that will build a consensus until we basically have dangerous AI, or in Eliezer Yudkowsky's view, we will in fact never have a consensus, where Paul Cristiano is more optimistic once we have in fact dangerous AI that we'll be able to recognize that. we probably won't respond productively to AI risk. Even if there was a consensus, probably we would not be able to rise to the challenge in any meaningful way. We can mess up even very basic challenges, and in this case, AI safety is a really difficult for many reasons, so we can certainly mess this up. So this is not really a point that Eliezer makes in his AGI ruin post, but it's quite clear that he holds opinions that are like this, or even more pessimistic. The existing state of alignment research is something that they are both very pessimistic about. We are not really making progress on the key difficulties, because we are focusing more on what is the area where we can make enough progress to like publish a research paper, instead of looking at the actual key challenges. Only quite few people are working on that. Eliezer Yudkowsky has the same points, but again in a substantially stronger statement. We can't recognize progress even if we came upon it. If we got $1 billion, that would not help us at all, because we can't recognize progress, and it will just drown everything out in noise. One thing that I would really like Paul Christiano's view on is like relatively few researchers. How many is that, and who is that? Because I think that would be something that would be really valuable, to have some idea about who are working on things that in Paul Christiano's view are likely to contribute. The last derail is what's it called? A Twitter hashtag or something that is being used by Eliezer Yudkowsky to describe when there is like social pressure to talk about AI risk and turn it into something that is about like standard political things. And Paul Christiano says it's probably a bit hyperbolic, but on point. Here is a poll by Eliezer Yudkowsky on Twitter that shows that more people think that paper clippers are bad, but a lot of people think that bias is a bigger problem. Excuse me for a moment. In the same way, a lot of people focus on smaller risks that are more realistic and not really existential in the way that we care about. And that's probably something that's not going to change until very late in the game, if at all. I think Eliezer Yudkowsky would agree, but in fact, I can't really find anything that Eliezer Yudkowsky has written about what the man on the street thinks about AI alignment, because I think Eliezer Yudkowsky just consider that totally irrelevant, and what the standard people who are not experts and don't have any particular qualification. I think he has basically given up on trying to convince this kind of people. An AI takeover could be very abrupt, perhaps something akin to a coup, and that's another agreement between the two. Paul Christiano thinks that killer robots might be part of it, and that is something that could happen indeed very abrupt, and the progress from AI having been involved in something like research until controlling killer robots may be very brief. Sorry. And yeah, this is also a bit that Eliezer Yudkowsky has talked about, but not very much. One of the things Paul Christiano agrees with Eliezer Yudkowsky is that most people don't see the singularity as something that can come very quickly after we have automated research by AI, and that's something that Paul Christiano thinks could take perhaps even months. So that's some substantially shorter timelines. It's not precisely what Eliezer talks about, because Paul Christiano seems to have a model where first there is like some kind of recursive self-improvement and or some improvement in AI capability, and then this kind of diffuses throughout society, and AI has a large impact, whatever that may be, and then after that we get singularity and some kind of takeover. Whereas Eliezer Yudkowsky doesn't really, in his world model, see a middle point where AI has enough effect on the world to be described as a large impact. It's mostly going from basically no impact to AI's control of everything. The way we normally solve technological problems is by trial and error in the scientific method, and unfortunately for alignment, this is not something that happens by default, because it's possible to work on capability without working on alignment, and it's just possible that we won't in fact solve alignment because we're not forced to it. We can just get by with standard gradient descent methods until we have extremely powerful AGI, and then it might be too late. So we cannot expect to get the strong kind of empirical feedback loops than we get in just about all other kinds of research. Again, this is not something that Eliezer Yudkowsky explicitly states in his AGI ruin, but I think he would agree with this. It has sometimes been posited that AI improvement would at some point hit a kind of intelligence ceiling around or slightly above the human level. Paul Christiano sees no particular argument why that should happen. In fact, it seems likely in his model that it will relatively quickly go from something that is substantially below the human level to something that is substantially above the human level. Again, this is also something Paul Eliezer agrees with. Most of these agreements that we are finding are in fact in some of Eliezer Yudkowsky's preliminaries. So we are not really, even though it is agreements, it's not on any particular reasons, some of the strong reasons Eliezer Yudkowsky presents for why AGI ruin is likely. If we had powerful AI somewhere, then it would be able to take over the world. That's something they both agree on, and I won't go into more details about that. Coordination failure is really likely in that it doesn't look like we will be able to solve that policy problem. This, in general, geopolitical coordination is hard, and here we have some stakes that are really ambiguous in that almost everyone agrees that there is no strong AI risk. It's basically rationalists and no one else. And there is a lot greater pressure to defect, in the sense that if the others are not building AGI and you're building AGI, you can potentially take over the world. So that's something that Paul Christiano agrees with Eliezer is likely to fail this policy problem to be solved. Humans won't necessarily rise to the challenge, and COVID has been a negative update for Paul Christiano. I think Eliezer Yudkowsky is substantially more negative about this. He's nowhere near 50-50 on this. So I don't really think this can be called an agreement. There is Eliezer Yudkowsky seems to be strongly negative on to the extent that we can rise to this challenge. On the more technical side, is there a utility function that really captures what human wants and what human values are? Paul Christiano says no. He thinks we should instead do something like reinforcement learning, where the reward function gets smarter in parallel with the agent being trained. What precisely it means that a function gets smarter is, of course, difficult to state in a concise way, but that's one way of summarizing his agenda. We if we try to train an AI to have a reward function that is like what kind of object we're trying to get, then we are unlikely to get an AI that is actually truly motivated to do this, because if it's smart enough, it will realize that it should do what we want it to do, even though it's not that's not what it's actually motivated to do, because that's how it preserves influence, like deceptive alignment. I think I would actually disagree with these two at this point, because right now I would expect us to see much more signs of deception if this was trivially true. In fact, Paul Christiano, a bit later than this, says that he expects that deceptive alignment requires superintelligence, and I strongly disagree with this. I believe that actually at the human level, it's quite possible to figure out that you should be deceptively aligned. Naive assisting is my all the headings are mine, and the text down here is mostly quotes. So it's more likely that the human will learn what is the environment. That's a lot easier than trying to learn something really complex, philosophically fraught, like trying to help humans. And if you try to get data from humans, some kind of feedback, then trying to learn this is difficult because there will be errors, for instance. So it's much more likely that the AI will actually learn the processes that are generating the reward signals, what is inside our brain, and update fully on that, on something like that. And that's probably what we're going to get if we don't do anything. If we just try to do simple reward learning from humans. The dying with dignity framing, that we shouldn't just assume that there's hope, but try to maximize the log odds of success, is something that Paul Christiano agrees with, and this is basically the dying with dignity strategy article from Miri. The current plan for aligning AI requires a lot of iteration and modification. The state of affairs is that if alignment turns out to be a big problem, then we'll have to learn about it and iteratively improve our approach. I'm a bit confused when Paul Christiano uses the word state of affairs. I think he means plans, but I'm quite unsure about whether that's actually what he is pointing towards. Eliezer, of course, is way more negative about this and believes that we'll not just learn a lot about it and iteratively improve, will fail to learn and not improve and die. Finally, in other research fields, you usually choose a research project that is just barely out of reach, so you can actually improve the state of the art. And alignment is not chosen for this reason. There's no one to ensure that the problem is fair and it's possible to solve the problem at all. It's possible that will fail because the problem is just too hard. And that's the point that Eliezer also makes. Finally, we're getting to the disagreements, of which we'll take the first 10. Paul Christiano says that these are mostly stated without arguments, so I have to dig deep to try to figure out what arguments could be made for this. So I'm not necessarily following Paul Christiano that closely in this part. The first is a complaint that Eliezer equivocates between saying, on one hand, you have to get alignment right on the first try, and on the second, that you can't learn anything about alignment before that critical first try. And these are two different statements, and Paul Christiano thinks that the first one is correct and the second is incorrect. Does Eliezer in fact equivote like this? I looked through this post and to try to see if I could find ways, and I was unable to find any places where Eliezer makes such an equivocation. He does state the first claim very explicitly, and later he actually states something that kind of sounds like the negation of this. Here is the exact quote. Section B is in general about what can we learn and what can't we learn about alignment before the critical first try. And in particular, point B13 seems to be about the kind of things that you can in fact not learn. So it seems strongly to me that Eliezer Yudkowsky is very explicit about both of these points, and there is no equivocation. But it's also possible that Paul Christiano is thinking about a different part. Okay, so what can we actually learn from alignment before the critical first try? Well, we can use the traditional research and development methodology to try to create toy models of alignment failures. We have standards for interpretability that it seems like we should be able. I think there was someone posted like a research roadmap, a tech tree or something like that. And we have theoretical questions we can't answer, and that seems like something we can in fact learn from now. I don't think that saying that there are theoretical questions we can't yet answer, I don't think that is something that we can talk about as feedback from what works. I think we are unlikely to get a resolution to the deeper theoretical questions from practical experiments. And the problem that here I think it's something that they would actually agree strongly on is that solving a scientific problem without being able to learn from experiments is really, really hard. And here this consideration makes the institutional problem vastly harder, but does not have such a large effect on the scientific problem. I'm a bit unsure about what precisely Paul Christiano means by this quote. I think a way Eliezer Yudkowsky talks about the two challenges with this. There's the fact that there is a deadline and we only get one try. And even if you in some way were able to relax this, it would still be a really, really deadly problem. So one way you could think about this, imagine that the institutional problem is solved, but the scientific problem is not solved. That would be like we are coordinated enough that we have all the time in the world to solve it, but we only get one attempt. So that is something that is substantially harder, substantially easier than the actual real problem, where the institutional problem is not solved. And the other way around would be that we have unlimited attempts, but we do have a sharp deadline. So we can try to build an aligned AI, and but at some point the institutional coordination will fail, and someone else will just build an unaligned AGI. So we do have a deadline. So I think that is what Paul Christiano is pointing towards, but I'm not sure. The topic of nanotechnology comes up, and Paul Christiano believes that once we have nanotech, we will surely have other technologies that can kill humans in more boring ways. I think this is a empirical question. Of course, it will eventually be revealed, but it depends. Like, what is actually the easiest way to kill humans? Is that by building large robots or small robots? I must admit, I haven't read the literature. I should read Eric Drexler, I guess. Eliezer Yudkowsky claims that he has in fact read what Eric Drexler has written about nanotechnology, strong nanotechnology. And I like, if Paul Christiano believes that big robots are easier than small robots, that there is another easier but more boring way to kill humans, then he should state, like, what is the actual problem with the nanotechnological pathway that Eliezer Yudkowsky is saying. Another thing that is likely to happen before we get nanotechnology is that the state of human research and development will be radically advanced by AI. It's a possibility, but it's also a possibility that AI research and development would just bypass humans and not, in fact, strongly contribute to advancing human research and development. Paul Christiano calls Eliezer Yudkowsky's scenarios cinematic, and they don't seem to like hold together. I feel calling them cinematic sounds like strange, almost like an argument from status or something like that. And is there a more realistic picture of AI development under the surface? That is in fact something that a lot of people have speculated on, in particular in the comments. Like when Eliezer is talking about nanotechnology and botulism in diamondoid bacteria like nanomachines, is that something he really means, or does he mean something else? A lot of people are thinking that he must mean something else. I have talked very little with Eliezer, but I have in fact talked with him, and he seems very, very much like a person who strongly says what he believes. So I would bet good money that when Eliezer says nanotechnology, he is in fact not using that as some kind of simile or metaphor for another technology. When he says nanotechnology, he means nanotechnology. Is it possible that the AI that is capable of killing us will, before that, not making any major technological contributions to society at large? That's a question that I think depends mostly on takeoff speeds. And that's of course an area where Eliezer and Paul Christiano are quite of different opinions. Paul Christiano believes that we are training AI to do things that look impressive. So if there's an AI that doesn't do impressive things, then we'll just not find that AI, because we are just using stochastic gradient descent to find the impressive AIs. So that means in general it will be the impressiveness will increase in a gradual fashion. At every point there will have been before that a slightly less impressive AI. I think depending on how you operationalize impressive, that may be true, but I would expect that the things that we are trying to make the AI do in general are things that may be impressive but are not dangerous, in the sense that that nanotechnology is dangerous and making beautiful drawings or something like that is not dangerous. And the fear is that if we get a general intelligence, it may be able to do some really, really impressive harmless things, and then the very next thing it does is something that is at roughly the same level of impressiveness, but just in a different domain, and that turns out to be really dangerous. Some of the framing, the words that Paul Christiano uses about Eliezer to describe his scenarios are somewhat derisively stated. Like, he imagines scenarios of AIs lying in wait to cause trouble later. That's almost certainly not how Eliezer would describe his own scenarios. It seems uncharitable, but on the other hand, Eliezer is also harsh when he writes, at least according to like Danish Morse. People are not as diplomatic as would be becoming of them. So I can't really fault Paul Christiano for pushing back on Eliezer in this way. One thing that I do wish to point out here is in this argument about whether we will have AIs that does something slightly less impressive civilly looking, I think that Paul Christiano seems strongly overconfident by using words such as definitely. I think there is a lot of reasons to believe that that it may go in a different way. Definitely seems like something that where you need really strong arguments to use this kind of word. Recursive self-improvement. How will that look in practice? Paul Christiano expects that this will basically look like, well, like humans doing research and development. I suppose that's possible, and I would even say that there is a high probability of this, but you could easily imagine AI research and development being a lot less scrutable. I could imagine that you ask GPT-3, how can I improve you for how can you give an architecture that is better, and then it makes, I don't know, a transformer where the diagram is reversed or something like that, and says, try this will be better, and then we try it, and it does in fact perform better, and we just don't know why. I think that is, I could see that happening. And a way that human research is, one thing that really makes it scrutable is that there are many humans working on an AI system, and they're talking with each other, exchanging intuitions and ideas, and if they are replaced or by a single unitary AI, then all the social artifacts, like people writing to each other about their intuitions, is lost, and I think that could be a substantial difference. And finally, it's possible that AI will just be able to do things in a different way than humans. I think we've seen a lot of examples of AIs working in human domains where it seems like they are working in a different ways than us. Will AI smart enough to improve ourselves be a crucial threshold? Paul Christiano thinks not. I think it could be, in fact. It depends whether it's a crucial threshold, depends on whether the speed will change to a large extent in my book. Of course, what does crucial mean? To my mind, if it changes the speed meaningfully, then that is a crucial threshold. How gradual will this be? Paul Christiano thinks that this will be a very gradual process. I think that when I conceptualize what will a superintelligence be able to do, or an AI, then Bostrom's framing of speed superintelligence, quantity superintelligence, and quality superintelligence. It seems to me that working on something like capabilities is something that is clearly possible to do by a speed superintelligence and a quantity superintelligence, and even at a lower level where it's not actually super intelligent, but just at a roughly human level, that seems like where speed and quantity trivial would be able to contribute to capabilities, because there is a nice feedback loop, right? If the code is actually running faster, then it's better, right? And having a lot of AIs that are working on this would be should be able to contribute much more to capability than to other things. In disagreement 4 and 7, there is an underlying pattern that I have called Paul's sequence of events. This is my interpretation of how Paul Christiano thinks the world is going to look like. So take this with a big grain of salt, please. The first thing that's going to happen is that AI contributes to research in some meaningful way. The second thing that will happen is that AI will be able to, in particular, accelerate alignment research. Then we'll get AI that improves capability, maybe doubling the pace. And at some point after that, we'll get dangerous AI. So that's kind of like perhaps this is a takeoff split into these parts. Perhaps it's the takeoff hasn't really started at this point. It's a bit unclear. Is this a likely sequence of events? I think I would be skeptical, because I feel that AI improving capability is a lot easier than AI improving alignment research. Alignment research has turned out to be really, really hard, and AI capability has turned out to be surprisingly easy. Not easy, but easier than we would have hoped. So in the 2 progress bar model, I think that AI is likely to push more on the capability progress bar. I'd like to be wrong, of course. I would like Paul Christiano to go into more details about how AI could help alignment research. Of course, he has given like a number of suggestions for how this could be made, but most of Paul Christiano's suggestions seems to be like, this is a strategy for how we could do it, rather than I think it is likely that this is the method that will be used. Like, for example, existing latent knowledge is a great idea, but I haven't heard any strong arguments from Paul Christiano saying in the actual future he expects that eliciting latent knowledge like methods are the ones that will actually be used in the future, because that's a much stronger claim than whether eliciting latent knowledge can be made to work. There's some agreement. One thing I would point out here is that self-improving AI may be hindered by the fact that it can't solve the alignment problem. That seems like in the old days where we just had a utility function, then could just copy that to a successive function. But that's not something we might not see that with a with large language models, for instance, or something like that. So how, to what extent will we see these two things, alignment research and capability research, growing at the same pace? One thing we could at least say is that if there is like a single AI that is improving, in that case, then as it grows in capabilities, then the alignment will always lack the improvement in capabilities, because it needs to improve in capabilities before it can contribute to alignment. So that in that extent, it might self-improve to the point where it can solve the alignment problem, and then you try to like use that solution, and then it doesn't work because it won't allow you to actually change it to be alignable, to be corrigible, or something like that. Pivotal acts, they seem misguided and unrealistic in Paul Christiano's view. I'm not sure I like the word unrealistic. I think misguided and unlikely to work is better to use. Paul Christiano thinks that we can reduce the period of risk with, and do something kind of like a pivotal act in like smaller parts. Kind of what Paul Christiano doesn't use the word weak pivotal act, but that is what Eliezer states. One of them is by advancing alignment research. I think definitely if you get good enough improvements in alignment research, that would count as a pivotal act. But in that, of course, sidesteps the discussion about whether it is good or bad, whether it's a pivotal act, and just to say that it's a good thing that we should pursue to have aligned AI do alignment research. Another way that we could get something that is kind of like a part of a pivotal act is by having something that could demonstrate that unaligned AI is dangerous. That's something that I have previously talked very positively about. I think in general, unfortunately, we will have to really convince a lot of people, because there is a lot of people who really want to build unaligned AI. And if we want to strongly convince 100% of the population of Earth, that requires really strong levels of persuasion, and I think that is dangerous in of itself. If you want to strongly persuade everyone so there is not a single person in the world who would like to deploy an unaligned AI, then I think that is basically a pivotal act. So Eliezer Yudkowsky's main complaint that these weak pivotal acts are unlikely to work is something that I feel Paul Christiano really isn't answering at this point. The third way that unaligned AI can, that a relatively aligned AI can stop unaligned AI, is by consuming the free energy of society, which is the thing, like it originally comes from an analogy with the efficient market. In an efficient market, there is no free energy, and that's the thing that an unaligned AI could use to grow very rapidly. Things like jobs that an AI could do would be an example. If for some reason there's a lot of jobs that an AI could do, but we still have humans doing them, and then suddenly an unaligned AI comes along and just can do all this and take over the jobs from all the humans and use that for disempowering or gaining economic wealth. That's an example of free energy being available for an unaligned AI. Unsecure computer systems is another example. we could, if we have an aligned AI that that checks every computer system in the world for vulnerabilities and then hacks them and patches them immediately, that would be an example of an AI that is performing like a part of a pivotal act, a weak pivotal act. And the question then is whether that is dangerous or not. I would expect that to be quite dangerous. Another example is better killer robots or something like that. That's also something that if we already have the best killer robots that can be made, then a misaligned AI can't obviously make better killer robots. And in general, managing the consequences of powerful AIs. Steve Burns have some rather tries to in the comments go into some details about what kind of free energy there is, and points out that control of nuclear weapons is something that right now is in the hands of humans, and if we have a world where there are AIs that are more intelligent than humans, then our two options is to hold onto it or to give control of the nuclear weapons to the AIs that we hope are aligned. And if we don't give control of all our nuclear weapons to AI, then there is some free energy. So consuming the free energy in this way seems really hard. And also, like, all the work that can be done by AI should be done by AI, and maximally effective killer robots and things like that seems like a world that is really, really, really bleak. In particular, if the AIs that we are giving control over the nuclear weapons and all the jobs and all killer robots, if we are not 100% sure they are perfectly aligned, then that seems really, really dangerous. So in fact, consuming all the free energy, to my mind, seems like something that is just about as dangerous as a pivotal act, but doesn't actually solve the problem. So I think having AI consume all the free energy is just worse in every way than a pivotal act. On the risks of pivotal acts, Paul Christiano believes that there is an overwhelming risk of destroying the world, and that is in fact also what Eliezer Yudkowsky says. He says that in his post on AGI ruin, he strongly expects that we will not do a pivotal act because in practice pivotal acts are just too hard. And the thing that will actually happen is we'll try to look for a good pivotal act and try to find some kind of miracle, and we won't find this miracle, and then we'll die. So the fact that pivotal act runs an overwhelming risk of destroying the world is something they might really agree on. Paul Christiano's preferred alternative is traditional policy influence. This, I believe, is what Eliezer Yudkowsky would call a weak pivotal act. And again, Paul Christiano really ought to try to defend this this act of traditional policy influence. He says that rejecting this requires extreme confidence about details of the policy situation. I think this is trivially wrong. In fact, to be able to say that traditional policy influence will not be sufficient only requires that you know of like a few defeaters, and when you know like there's no way you could convince the Chinese government to go along with this, then you don't actually need to know a lot of details about the policy situation to be able to predict that this will in fact not work. Paul Christiano admits that this is something that would be an unusual success in historical terms, but again, much better than the pivotal acts. I think that there might in fact be a very different disagreement with Paul Christiano and Eliezer Yudkowsky than what Paul Christiano is pointing to here. If we assume the case that Eliezer Yudkowsky believes that a pivotal act has 1 in 100 chance of working, and traditional policy has 1 in 10,000, and Paul Christiano also agrees 100% that pivotal acts are 99% likely to fail, but is much more optimistic about traditional policy. In this case, they shouldn't debate the pivotal acts. What they actually should debate is traditional policy. To what extent is that likely to work? And I think that is an interesting case, and I think that is to a large extent. If Paul Christiano is very, very optimistic about traditional policy influence, then I would really like to hear why he's so optimistic about that. Finally, in his criticism of pivotal acts, he claims that Eliezer underestimates how difficult it would be for an AI developer to covertly take over the world. At this point, we should of course say that it's not an AI developer alone. It's an AI developer plus a moderately aligned narrow superintelligence. The second thing Eliezer Yudkowsky underestimates is how strongly and effective governments would respond to the possibility of an AI developer taking over the world. And finally, how toxic this kind of plan is. So, will governments be able to effectively react to the possibility that, say, DeepMind will create a superintelligence that will take over the world? Well, if they were doing that, then they might do that now, because the possibility is in fact there right now. And as far as I can tell, governments are, well, they're certainly not strongly and effectively responding to this. As far as I can tell, governments are totally oblivious to this possibility. So we're looking at a complete intelligence failure right now. It is possible it will change, but it's also very possible that it will in fact not change at all. Eliezer Yudkowsky is accused by Paul Christiano of being sloppy in some of the topics that he's dealing with. The first is on convergent incentives. So I looked up, here is an article about instrumental convergence, where Eliezer Yudkowsky goes into substantial details on convergent incentives. The deep nature of consequentialism is another area where Paul Christiano thinks Eliezer Yudkowsky is sloppy. I found the article here, where Eliezer Yudkowsky goes in details. And finally, he's sloppy on generalizing outside of a training distribution. I couldn't really find anything formal that Eliezer Yudkowsky has written on this topic, at least by looking for 10 minutes. It's possible you could ask Eliezer Yudkowsky if he has in fact written any rigorous thing about this. But to my mind, this is an isolated demand for rigor, because these two posts up here are in fact quite formal and quite rigorous. They are not perfectly rigorous, and they're not meant to be perfectly rigorous, but they are at a rather high quality level, at least as far as I can tell. It's a bit difficult to tell for certain, but I think almost all arguments that are used within AI alignment are less rigorous and less formal and less and more sloppy than what Eliezer Yudkowsky is presenting. And in fact, even though Eliezer's reasoning may be sloppy, Paul Christiano basically agrees that they are roughly right, but it's just that we can't really have a strong probability that they're true when we have a chain of reasoning. In particular, on generalization, Paul Christiano claims that it is subtle, and we can learn a lot about these kind of points in advance, but we just don't do that right now. To my mind, we can learn about generalizing outside of the training distribution at a below human level right now, but that doesn't necessarily tell us a lot about how a superhuman AI can generalize. In particular, I don't think that we can, when Paul Christiano say we can learn a lot about it, I think that's very unlikely. We can speculate and we can get some ideas about how generalization outside of the training distribution looks at a low level, but we can't really truly learn and get strong knowledge about this in any way. Paul Christiano believes that the result of this sloppy reasoning by Eliezer is that he's wildly overconfident. I think I would, if I was Paul Christiano, I would go through some of these articles here by Eliezer Yudkowsky and try to find an explicit error. Because if, in fact, Paul Christiano is right that Eliezer Yudkowsky has written some sloppy articles, then there must be some mistakes, right? If this is a sloppy article, then there would be some kind of mistake that could prove to us that Eliezer Yudkowsky is doing sloppy reasoning. To me, it doesn't look sloppy, but I'm no expert. I'm just unable to really strongly evaluate this claim. So how much will change when we go from a roughly human level to a super intelligent level? Paul Christiano says that the training strategies don't need to handle much of a shift from a low level to a high level of intelligence. I think that is missing the point slightly, in that it's not really training strategies that need to change or when the distribution shifts. The problem is that the alignment strategy needs to change. And again, Eliezer is claimed to be making a confident statement about how AI is going to change, and I don't think really it's the nature of AI that's going to change. Eliezer states this as there will be new external options opening, and even more internal choices and modes are going to open as the AI becomes more capable. And that's different from saying that the nature of AI is changing. Paul Christiano says that Eliezer is probably wrong and clearly overconfident. The way I think about this is that there is, like, this is of course really simplified, like there is a current AI level, and then there is the level that CERN is on, and then there's the level that Paul Christiano is on, and then there's a super intelligent level. And it seems clear to me that going from CERN's level to Paul Christiano's level is a qualitative difference. Paul Christiano can clearly think of a lot of strategies and consideration and desiderata that I can't think of. And in the same way, we should expect that an AI that goes from the current level to a super intelligent level, it must pass through the CERN level and the Paul Christiano level to get to the super intelligent level. And it seems like if there is a big distributional shift between these two, then it seems to me very likely that there is a very large distributional shift going from a subhuman level to a super intelligent level. Finally, FOOM, the intelligence explosive thesis. Eliezer strongly expects that we will have some kind of FOOM. Paul Christiano disagrees with this. This is something we've talked about before, and he claims Eliezer's position is probably wrong and clearly overconfident. I think, in fact, Eliezer has not made a really, really strong argument for the FOOM, and he is not, in fact, claiming a really, really high probability of an explosive takeoff. I think like he's not committing to any kind of number, so this is just me. The vibe I get from Eliezer is something like 80%, maybe 90% for a fast takeoff, and if Paul Christiano is 30%, then clearly overconfident, and it seems like a very strong statement if the differences between their probabilities are not larger than this. And of course, the issue of FOOM is something they've talked a lot about, and one place they didn't talk very much about FOOM is in Eliezer Yudkowsky's post-AGI ruin. It has very little about FOOM. There is one part that perhaps relies a little on FOOM, but most of it basically does not. The AGI FOOM, the AGI ruin post is about other reasons why we are probably doomed. So I'd like to end with this, the last comment on Paul Christiano's thread by LC, which is just, I hope you're right. I hope Paul Christiano is right. And that is, has the most unbalanced moderation here I've ever seen, with 52 people believing that this is a true statement, and very few people believing that this is actually something that contributes. So I too hope that Paul Christiano is right and Eliezer Yudkowsky is wrong. We'll see more about that next time.